Well, hi there. Ollie Anderson here. You're listening to Creative Status. This is a podcast about being a real human being, about breaking down some of the building blocks of the human condition that are universal, that are common to us all. Some of the things that can allow us to unblock ourselves at the level of our relationship with our identity, the ego, so that we can ultimately move on the path towards wholeness, a deeper connection to ourselves, a deeper connection to other people, and a deeper connection to life. Traditionally, this has been an interview podcast, and there are some more interviews in the pipeline. The last 5 or 6 episodes, something like that, have been solo episodes, which is just me talking about things. That's because I totally burned out on doing interviews for a while. I was just doing them all the time, and I needed a break. That's kind of related to the theme of this podcast episodes, because I want to talk about sympathetic dominance, getting into a state of being where our nervous system is out of regulation. Our parasympathetic nervous system is not doing what it needs to do because we've stressed ourselves out so much, and looking at how we can release some of the unnecessary tension in our lives that we carry within ourselves so that we can regulate our nervous system and put ourselves back on the path to wholeness and realness and truth. Because ultimately, a lot of the things we talk about on the podcast, and if you're new to the podcast, welcome. A lot of the things we talk about on the podcast, in fact, everything we talk about on the podcast, is ultimately about the journey from fragmentation to wholeness. If your nervous system is out of regulation, then you're never really going to be able to connect to wholeness as deeply as possible, because ultimately connecting to wholeness boils down to trust. You can only trust if you're relaxed, and that means getting your nervous system into a regulated state so that you're breathing properly, you're not panicking, you're not seeing threats where there aren't threats, and you can just trust life and flow with life. And so it's really, really important to understand the main sources of tension in our lives, which is what we're going to talk about in this podcast, what we can do about them, and then how we can move forward with more flow instead of force, more release instead of tension, but how we can keep a healthy level of stress and tension so that we can keep growing through our edge and becoming the realest, most true and authentic version of ourselves. So that's what we're going to talk about. I almost said that I'm not going to make this a long episode, but I've swore a solemn oath to myself in the last one that I would never say that, because sometimes I say it's not going to be a long one and then it is a long one. So let's get right into this. Ultimately, I'm going to give you 3 takeaways, which is that there are 3 main sources of tension in our lives that we can do something about because it brings unnecessary friction into our experience. I'll give you those in a minute. First, let's just start with a quick discussion of the nervous system. We won't go into too much detail, and what sympathetic dominance is, how it shows up in people's lives, and why it's important to know this stuff so you can start dealing with it. So if you haven't heard, we all have a nervous system. It's composed of various different streams, let's say, that send signals to the brain and that can affect the way that we perceive the world and then the way that we interpret the world, which affects everything that we do. We got the central nervous system, which is basically, it runs down our spine and it sends signals to the brain. That's the abridged version of that. But then we also have the autonomic nervous system, which is a kind of involuntary nervous system, which basically does all of the work beneath the surface before we even get to the level of thinking about things. The autonomic nervous system is broken down into 2 different streams, as I'm calling them for some bizarre reason. The sympathetic nervous system, which is often called the fight or flight system, that basically prepares us for action by increasing the heart rate, dilating the pupils, slowing digestion, releasing hormones like adrenaline. And then we got the parasympathetic nervous system, which is known as the rest and digest system, which basically does the opposite. It's the yin to the yang, if you want to use that language, of the sympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system, it promotes relaxation, as the rest and digest thing suggests. It reduces our heart rate, aids digestion, facilitates recovery and healing. It helps us to breathe properly and all these kind of things. And both of these parts of the nervous system are really, really important, just to state the obvious, but they also need to be balanced for us to have the optimum experience as a human being here on planet Earth. And because there are so many external sources stress out there in the modern world. And we also have a lot more internal sources of stress, which we'll get into because of our internal relationship with ourselves. So many people are running around either on the verge of sympathetic dominance, which just means that the sympathetic nervous system is overly active compared to the parasympathetic branch or stream. So many people are running around with sympathetic dominance, which is ultimately causing all kinds of problems and all kinds of unnecessary symptoms like elevated heart rate and blood pressure, tense muscles, difficulty relaxing or sleeping, poor digestion, bloating, constipation, anxiety, irritability, fatigue, despite being in a hyper alert state, all kinds of things that people often identify as just being part of their personality or just part of their default experience. They're just actually, because their nervous system has gone haywire, and if they can remove some of the unnecessary sources of stress and tension in their lives, they can balance themselves out. And then when they balance themselves out, it actually affects their personality because they're not filtering everything through the frame that this heightened state of stress has been causing them to view everything through. But also they're going to be more relaxed. They're going to be able to trust life more. They're going to be able to face themselves more. They're going to just generally have a better time because, to be quite honest, and to just make this as simple as possible, the quality of our life is ultimately about how much we can slow down and relax. And if we're getting really worked up and we're on the hamster wheel of just busy thoughts going around in our head because the sympathetic nervous system is constantly seeing threats and pumping adrenaline into our system, then we don't have the best experience that we can have. But even more importantly, if you want to say that, we don't get the results that we want from life because we're never actually in life. Something that you might have heard me say before, if you've listened to the podcast before, you've seen my other stuff. I like to say, if you put something real in, you get something real out. If you put something unreal in, you get something unreal out. Jesus said it in a slightly different way. He said a corrupt tree brings forth bad fruit or something like that. And ultimately, it's just a way of saying that the things we put into our life, the input, are going to affect the process that we go through when we're doing things, and that affects the output. And so if we're in this place of sympathetic dominance where we're not really present in our lives, but we're trying to do things with our lives, then we're actually putting something unreal into our lives. And so the results that we get end up being unreal as well. It becomes a case of unreal in, unreal out. And so if you want to live the real life, which means that you're moving towards wholeness and you're constantly growing and evolving and you're living your values and your true intentions and all the amazing things that you can do with the human experience, then actually a very important foundation is to look at your relationship with your own nervous system and how it's affecting your view of yourself and other people and life itself, so that you can regulate it if need be, remove the unnecessary tension and friction that is causing you to not see life clearly, and then to be able to move forward with trust and flow and acceptance on all of the amazing virtues and qualities that all the great spiritual traditions have spoken about, that you can only get if you're in your parasympathetic nervous system. If your parasympathetic nervous system is not regulated, you can't trust life. You can't trust anything because you're constantly going to be perceiving threats. Some of those threats may have been real once upon a time, but probably, and we'll get into this in a second, there will be extra levels of threat that you are perceiving because of your inner relationship with yourself and the way that you're perceiving things, which kind of spirals negatively because the adrenaline and the cortisol and all the other hormones that are getting pumped into you if you do have sympathetic dominance are just making things worse. And so that is why it's important to work on this. And now I'm going to give you 3 different sources of tension in our lives that you can start to deal with one by one, which are going to help you regulate your nervous system and just be good for you in general anyway, because it's going to carry you forward in a real, healthy, true way. So in every one of these episodes, I like to give you 3 takeaways. There are 3 different kinds of tension that we often carry for completely unnecessary reasons. When we do this, it just adds unnecessary friction to our experience of life. And that friction gives us constant feedback that there's something wrong. And so if we can remove the tension, we can remove a lot of the unnecessary bullshit from our experience. That's ultimately why it's so important to work on these different areas. So we're going to them one by one, but just so you know, the 3 areas are very simple. It's physical tension, the level of your muscular tension that you carry in your body, and also your breathing. Then we're going to talk about mental tension, which is just our belief system, ultimately, how it keeps us from the truth, how it makes us fragmented, how we may cling on to an identity that is not real, which causes this unnecessary friction. And then finally, we're going to talk about emotional tension. Emotional tension is simply just shame, guilt, trauma, all of the unresolved emotional stuff that we fear facing, because it's going to cause us to basically have to let go of certain things that we've attached to at the level of the ego. And it's also going to bring up some of the shadow self stuff, the things that we've disowned and we're not ready to face yet about who we really are. And so when we're walking around with tension at any of those levels, the physical, the mental, or the emotional, all we're really doing is just exacerbating this problem of sympathetic dominance. We're just keeping the nervous system in this heightened state of alertness, and it's just causing us to become way more stressed than we need to be. And so the way to get rid of tension is to start chipping away at it piece by piece and letting go of the things that we're holding on to physically, mentally, and emotionally, so that we can free ourselves and start flowing again. So all of these 3 levels are interconnected. The mind-body system is one system. And so it's not like these things are separate entities or separate parts of who we are, but we're going to look at them one by one. But I'm just saying this so you know that you are one system and it is all kind of interconnected. But anyway, with the physical tension, it's kind of self-explanatory. So many of us live sedentary lifestyles. We're in offices all day. We're hunched over computers. We're bending our necks down, staring into our phones and kind of scrolling endlessly through whatever it is that we're doing on there. And even if we do get exercise, it may just be one kind of exercise. Maybe we just go to the gym and we lift some weights. Maybe we do cardio. We're doing generally a lot of very yang activities, let's say. So there's yang, which is where we're just kind of going for it. We're very active. We're doing things. And then there's yin, which balances it out, where we're basically loosening up, doing nothing. The nervous system, in the way that we've been talking about it, kind of reflects that dichotomy as well. Like the yang is the sympathetic nervous system, and the yin is the parasympathetic nervous system. And this also explains probably why so many people do have sympathetic dominance, because our culture is very yang. But anyway, when you've got this tension in your muscles, you might not realize that it's there because you get accustomed to it and you think it's normal. But ultimately, if you are in this situation and you're carrying tension in your muscular system, it is just going to affect your experience as you move through the world and you do things, and it's going to cause you to be a lot more uptight than you necessarily would be if you were releasing this tension. A few weeks ago, I was doing a yoga session with somebody, and we got the foam roller out, and this was somebody that I thought was like super flexible. They were very flexible, but we got this foam roller out, and she was just kind of rolling around kind of in agony. That's a bit dramatic or hyperbolic, but anyway, she was rolling around just really feeling that there was just so much hidden tension within her muscles that she didn't even know about. And by the end of that session, when she had released that tension through the foam roller and then through some yin yoga, it was like she had just dissolved. It was like a totally different version of her. And the lesson that I learned when we went through that is just so many of us are just walking around with tension that has probably been there for years and years and years, and we just don't even know about it. And that affects the way that we relate to ourselves and the world at an unconscious level, definitely. And then every so often at a conscious level, when we realize that, you know, we can't bend over and touch our toes like we used to, or whatever it is, or we just feel kind of uptight. So anyway, the point is, when we've got that tension in our body, it's ultimately going to affect the way that we go through life, the way that we do things. And so one way to start relaxing and to getting in that parasympathetic nervous system is to start making an active choice about releasing some of that tension on a daily basis. And it doesn't have to be complicated. Maybe you do some morning stretches. Maybe you whack the foam roller out. I have a thing called a rumble roller. I have no affiliation with whoever made the rumble roller. Like, I've had it for years. It's a foam roller, but it's got all these kind of knobbles in it. And it is literally one of the best things in my whole life. I just love hopping on that thing and, giving myself like a shoulder massage or like the back of my calves, whatever it is that I need. There is just so much tension that we accumulate. And if you have some system in your daily routine, your weekly routine, then you're going to be able to start releasing this tension, whether you know it's there or not. Ultimately, the lesson is, I think, that we all just accumulate this kind of tension as we go through life. And so we need to find some way of balancing it out. So if you want to get practical with it, one of the best ways to release this tension, like I've said, is a foam roller. Yin yoga is absolutely amazing, completely incredible. In fact, if you want, I actually created a yin yoga flow last week, whenever it was. That's been uploaded to YouTube. It's a very deep, dissolving yin yoga practice. It goes for 75 minutes. If you do that, that is definitely going to release some tension from your muscular system. The other thing about the physical tension that we carry is our breathing. And so another thing that you can do to start releasing tension is to just slow down your breathing and to do some pranayama or some breathing exercises, some breath work. The one that I always recommend to people, and I think I've recommended it on the podcast before, maybe when I did the episode about the morning routine, is to do 4-7-8 breathing. 4-7-8 breathing just means that you inhale for 4 seconds, you retain the breath for 7 seconds, and then you exhale for 8 seconds. And you can do cycles of that. Another one that you can do is called box breathing. That's where you go 4, 4, 4, 4. So you inhale for 4, hold it for 4, exhale for 4, hold it again for 4. And it's called box breathing because it's, the ratio is the same all the way around. That is going to help you to release physical tension as well, because when you're in this sympathetic dominance and you're stressed out and you've got all this adrenaline flooding your system because of the sympathetic nervous system going crazy, then ultimately your breathing gets affected. You start breathing very quickly. Again, your breath affects your personality, whether you know it or not. So like the physical tension in your body, it affects your personality and the way that you relate to life. And so if you learn to regulate your breath and to slow down, that is going to release this physical tension. So that is the first thing, the first little takeaway. We have tension that we carry in our bodies at the level of our muscular system and our breath. It doesn't need to be there. There's things we can do about it. And then when we start releasing it, it's going to affect these other levels as well, the mental and the emotional. So let's get onto those quickly. So for brevity, let's say that most mental tension comes down to the choices that we make. The choice to either be real or unreal. Surprise, surprise. I love talking about what's real and what's not. Real means that we're ultimately aligned with the truth. We're moving towards wholeness, but also that we're taking responsibility for our lives and the way that things are. Unreal means that we have a belief system that doesn't serve us in some way, either because it's limiting us or because we're believing something because we want to believe it for purely emotional reasons. So for example, we may want to believe that Prince Charming is going to turn up on our doorstep one day because we just have this underlying need for love or whatever it is, or, Princess Charming, can go both ways. We have some belief that something's going to happen or that something's true because it just makes it easier for us to handle life. When our beliefs and the choices that we make about our beliefs take us away from reality, then it just ends up causing friction and it stresses us out. And the reason for that is because the only way that we can get results in life, the only way things are going to work in life, is if the beliefs that we have and the choices that we make align us with the truth about things, because only in truth, only in reality are we going to be able to get any results. And so if our belief system takes us away from that, we're just constantly going to get stressed because things aren't going to work out. And so mental tension comes from having a belief system that constantly gives us feedback from life that we're doing something wrong. That causes anxiety in many, many cases. It's because the image that we carry of ourselves is a reaction to the underlying emotional stuff that we carry, which we'll get onto in a second. But for now, the only takeaway we need to say is that if you want to get your nervous system regulated, then you really need to do this thing that I've talked about a lot on the podcast before, where you just live in such a way where you try to uncover the truth and then live the truth. That doesn't mean you're always going to have the truth. We all have limited perceptions. We all have limited interpretations about life. But if you keep looking at your beliefs, you keep testing your own assumptions, you keep asking yourself if the limits that you're putting on yourself or the image that you're carrying of yourself that's making you miserable, if you keep questioning those things and figuring out if it's true or not, then eventually you're going to dissolve anything that's not true and you're going to be more aligned with the flow of life. When you accept life on those very real terms, then you can also start to do things that are going to cause you to be less stressed in general. So by that, all I mean is that there are a lot of really simple things that we kind of resist at the level of our mentality, at the level of our belief system, because we don't want them to be true. But they're just universal truths about life that apply to all of us. So the example I always use, there's two examples I always use. One is the law of cause and effect. So if we want something from life, ultimately getting whatever that is an effect. And there's going to be some process that we can go through where we are the cause, or we live as the cause to get the desired effect. We're going from point A to point B, basically. And say you want to start a business, for example, getting to point B of having that business up and running is going to require working the process of cause and effect to get to get the results from your business that you want to get. The other thing that people often resist because of their mentality is just prioritization and being organized and doing things in a specific order. And so let's take the example of washing the dishes, for example, right? Like so many people, there's so many memes on the internet about washing the dishes and how it's like this, it's like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill and stuff like that because it just keeps piling up. So many people, they get stressed by little things like that and then they leave it. But then when they leave it, it just builds up more and more and more. And so instead of just having a few dishes to wash, they eventually have like a whole mountain literally of dishes to wash. And then they get stressed. And it's not just with the dishes, like people do this with all kinds of things in their life. They keep putting things off and then it becomes a problem. And so ultimately, again, this comes down to this mentality of just facing life head on while it's happening so that you can deal with things while they're happening on a foundation of acceptance, and then they don't get out of control and stress you out. And so ultimately, that's all we need to say right now, I guess, about the mentality thing. We add unnecessary tension to our lives by being truth avoidant. And if we can shift into facing the truth and uncovering the truth and testing our assumptions about ourselves, the world, and reality, and then align ourselves with whatever we learn by doing that, then we're way less likely to have any unnecessary tension in our lives because we don't have that extra level of friction caused by unreal beliefs that hold us back from actually just getting where we need to be. So the final takeaway is this idea of emotional stress. Emotional stress comes into the mental stress and the physical stress. Like I said a few minutes ago, whenever it was, all of these things are interconnected. If we have underlying emotional stress, then that is going to be stored in our bodies and it's going to cause tension. So I've heard yoga teachers, it was Brian Kest actually, who was on the podcast ages ago. He says that a lot of trauma is stored in our hips, for example. I don't know how true that is, but just as an example of the body holding onto our emotional stuff, it's a good one, and it makes a lot of sense to me, really, because I've seen people cry in yoga sessions when they're doing frog pose or whatever it is, and they release that tension that's in the body. So again, all these things are connected. When we have a lot of underlying emotional trauma or shame or guilt as well, that also affects our mentality, because a lot of the time we don't want to face those emotions, and so we create an identity for ourselves, a version of ourselves where we're basically hiding those emotions from ourselves. I always call it the ego, and then I'd say that all the underlying emotional stuff and a million other things that can be hidden just end up forming the shadow self. But we need to embrace the shadow self. We need to face the shadow self, which is why the tagline for this podcast is deconstruct the ego, integrate the shadow, and then trust life, manifest a real life. But really that means trust life. We need to face that stuff so that we can allow ourselves to get back on this path to wholeness. And ultimately, the emotional tension that I want to talk about quickly in this little episode is what happens when we resist that emotional stuff for too long. Normally because we're judging ourselves. People tend to judge themselves as being weak if they feel certain emotions, or not being good enough, or not being, strong enough, or whatever it is. If they feel any kind of underlying emotional stuff that isn't all about sunshine and puppy dogs and rainbows. And so the tendency often is just hide from it. When we do hide from it, we cause more tension for ourselves, which just makes the sympathetic dominance even worse. It causes us to not be able to relax because there's always that feeling that something's missing. There's an itch that can't be scratched. We constantly spend our lives kind of wandering through the void, wondering if we're ever going to feel whole again. And the answer to that question, of course, is no. We'll never feel whole again until we face those emotions head on. There's a saying I'm always throwing out there. I believe it came from John Bradshaw in his amazing book, Healing the Shame That Binds You. He said emotions are energy in motion. And that is so true. Like emotions constantly, they just move. And if we let them move, they dissolve. If we hold on to them because of our mental relationship with ourselves, or because of our the emotional tension that we carry, the tension ultimately between our real emotions, what we really feel, and the way that we want to identify as a kind of reaction to that, and the physical tension that can lead to, because a lot of emotions are stored in the body, like we said, then ultimately, if we don't face that stuff, we're just going to have a bad time, because we're going to bring more friction into our lives. That friction is going to feed into all these other areas of tension that we've talked about. And ultimately, we're just going to stay in this prolonged state of sympathetic dominance. And so if we can release that bodily tension, we can improve our mental relationship with ourselves, and we can find the courage to face our emotional stuff and let it heal itself, because that's actually what will happen if you just let it do what it needs to do, then a lot of this unnecessary tension will dissolve, and we can balance out the nervous system, and we can kind of get where we need to be. And so ultimately, that's all I wanted to share in this podcast. The physical stuff, the mental stuff, and the emotional stuff, a lot of that stuff is stuff, that was a lot of stuffs in one sentence. A lot of that stuff is just stuff that we can choose to let go of by living in a way that is more aligned with how the parasympathetic nervous system wants us to be, which means that we're relaxed, we're breathing slowly, we're stretching mentally and emotionally and physically. And so ultimately, I guess what we're saying is that the lesson is that what's good for the body is good for the mind. If we can stretch ourselves in a healthy way, we can find healthy tension, which allows us to break through our edge and release. Then we can put ourselves back on the path to wholeness, and we don't have to be stressed out all the time. We don't have to have sympathetic dominance. We can be balanced, and then when we're balanced, we can trust life, because we can trust ourselves. Like I said, the parasympathetic nervous system is basically a prerequisite for trust. And when we get to that point, that's when life starts to really become real, and we can be who we need to be, because we're not acting through the filter of what the sympathetic nervous system is showing us. We're acting from the truth, which is that we're balanced and we're on a foundation of being rooted in something real. So that was a podcast about that, sympathetic dominance, and the different levels of tension. I feel like I rambled a little bit at places, so I apologize. I can't even talk now. But anyway, so yeah, there's 3 different levels of tension: the physical, the mental, the emotional. There's things you can do about it. So make the choice and do something, especially if you feel stressed all the time, you feel burned out. Obviously, there's way more things that can be done than the quick examples I gave at each of those levels. But if you want to make this practical, the stuff that you just heard in this podcast, what I would recommend is just starting with one thing. Start with one thing at each level. One thing for the physical that's going to loosen you up and that's going to help you breathe more and stretch your muscles. One thing for the mental side of this, the mental tension. What beliefs do you need to let go of? Like, how are you holding yourself back with the way that you're perceiving and interpreting your life? There's probably something, if you are stressed, that you're holding on to that is resistance to the truth about who you are, what life is. Figure that out through journaling or something like that, or any other method that works for you. There's no like right or wrong about any of this. With the emotional, what's going on? Like, what emotions do you need to face? Again, journaling is a really good thing to do. Meditation, yin yoga. Yin yoga, I gave as an example for the physical thing, but it's also great for the mental thing as well, and the emotional thing, because there's so much stuff that comes up when we just still and present with ourselves in a yin yoga session. Meditation as well. But anyway, the practical tip is that for each of these 3 areas, find one thing that you're going to do and commit to it. If you want to go deeper into making some of these changes in your life, I recently put a thing on my website which I've called the BAM challenge. BAM stands for bare ass minimum. So ultimately, this little challenge is a 7-day thing where every day for 7 days, I'll just send you an email with one little thing that you can do to start improving your life. I called it the bare ass minimum challenge because I don't want to make it too complicated. I've got another thing that I, share as a kind of lead magnet, if you want to call it that. I called the personality transplant. That is like a very in-depth course. Like, it's amazing if I do say so myself, but like nobody really has time for that, to be quite honest with you. And the BAM challenge is just very simple. It's the bare ass minimum that you can do to start improving your life and start moving forward. So anyway, I was like meditation, exercise, and then some stuff about figuring out your vision and your habits and all that kind of thing. So if you want to check that out, go to ollyanderson.co.uk/BAM. I'll put a link in the show notes. If anyone wants to talk to me, then you can book a call on my website. Just go to ollyanderson.co.uk/talk. I help people to implement all this stuff all the time and to transform their lives and start moving forward with their vision and the goals and the realness and all the good stuff. But either way, regulating that nervous system, letting go of tension is always a good thing to do because it gives you a solid foundation for having a relationship with life, with yourself, with the truth. And then you have a place of acceptance, ultimately, on which you can build something that is going to serve you and serve everybody else around you by extension. So go sort out that nervous system, basically. Hope this helped. Thanks a bunch, and peace to you.